My name is McInerney and I'm the librarian here in Dublin City Library and Archive, and I'll be hosting the talk today. So today's talk is titled The Ballyfermot Troop Train Ambush of the 8th of July 1921, the last major action of the Irish War of Independence, okay? So the talk today will explore how a troop train carrying military supplies, horses and civilians was ambushed by members of the 4th Battalion Dublin Brigade IRA as it passed under the railway bridge near the then rural hamlet of Ballyfermot. The incident occurred hours before the formal announcement of the truce and marked the end of the War of Independence. So our speakers today, as I mentioned, are Liz Gillis and Cathy Scuffil. Liz is a historian and author from the Liberties. She has a degree in Irish history and is currently working as a researcher for the History Show on RTE Radio and also lectures at Chaplain College Dublin. Liz is the author of 6 books about the Irish Revolution, including Women of the Irish Revolution, The Hales Brothers and the Irish Revolution, May 25th, the burning of the Custom House 1921, and she co-wrote We Were There, 77 Women of the Easter Rising. So Liz has also worked as a researcher on numerous publications, television and radio documentaries covering the period, and she was co-organiser of the annual conference on the burning of the Customs House. In 2018, Liz was a recipient of the Lord Mayor's Award for her contribution to Irish history. So that's Liz. And then, of course, we have Cathy here, Cathy Scuffil, historian in residence. Dublin born and reared, Cathy's interest in local history was formed at an early age, encouraged by her parents, who also shared a love of Dublin. She was honorary secretary and founding member of the Dolphinsbarn Historical Society in 1986, compiling and editing their publication By the Sign of the Dolphin in 1993. In addition to an honours degree in business and management, Cathy also holds both a certificate and a master's in local history from NUI Maynooth. Her master's thesis research was published by Four Courts Press, called the South Circular Road Dublin on the eve of the First World War. And an abridged version of this was awarded the Silver Medal by the Old Dublin Society in 2018. Cathy was actively involved in a wide range of community events during 1916 Rising Centenary commemorations, researching the Rialto Kilmainham 1916 commemoration photographic exhibition and the publication of 1916 in the South Dublin Union for St James's Hospital. So Cathy is currently working as a historian in residence with Dublin City Council for the South Central and South East areas, and she is a consultant for other projects as well. So I would like to thank both speakers for giving us this talk today. And I also want to introduce my colleague, Senior Librarian Gillian Colton, who will be kindly co-hosting the event for us today. So thanks very much for that, Gillian. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is I'd like to invite you during the talk, if you want to pop questions in the question, we have a Q&A chat box, so you can pop the questions in there. So that would be great. So without holding you too much longer, I will hand you over to today's speakers, Liz and Cathy. So it's Cathy is going first for us today. Is that right? Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Cathy.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to both Anne-Marie and Gillian for hosting today, and of course my comrade in arms, if you like, Liz Gillis, because we researched this talk together. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. Absolutely delighted. Over 50 people. We must be doing something right. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Bear with us, and we will build up to the ambush, and then we'll talk about the ambush. So 2 seconds now. So the Ballyfermot troop train ambush happened on Friday, the 8th of July, 1921. The centenary beckons. And in fairness to looking at an event like this, it gives us an opportunity to really give a summary of what was the War of Independence and an event that happened right at the very end of it. So without further ado, I'll just work through it. So Ballyfermot, 100 years ago. But this is Ballyfermot today. Most people know it as a busy suburb, plenty of houses, industrial estates. It has a railway line going through it. It has the canal going through it. And of course, it really is the first hamlet, the first actual town outside of Inchicore. It has a very, very close relationship to the Inchicore Works, where all of the workings around our railway system took place. And that is key to our story today. So holding that image kindly given to us by Google Maps, you can see all the Ballyfermot, those little keyholes and circles that form the layout of all the housing estates out there and the industrial estates there. But I'm going to bring you back 100 years to a map of the area then. And what will really strike you about it is how rural it is. All those white areas indicate fields, farms, cottage clusters, but you can also see in the, as I had mentioned, the railway works pretty much dominating the whole landscape of the area. And that's key because they're an important employer. Even for a rural area, people made their way into Inchicore for their jobs. A busy, busy area indeed. But these white areas are all fields, all meadows, countryside, a rural hamlet, a rural suburb on the outskirts of Dublin City. And if you were at the railway in Ballyfermot, one of your key locations, believe it or not, would have been the Ballyfermot Castle Church and Graveyard. Now, anyone who knows the Ballyfermot area today will know the Lawns Park. And what lies underneath that park are the remains of the castle and the church and graveyard. They're actually under that particular park. So imagine you're standing in the park, and at the time, 100 years ago, you would have had a ruined castle, you would have the ruins of a church and a graveyard that was just falling out of use at that time. And you look up the road and you're looking towards the bridges over the railway, and in the far distance you can make out the other bridge over the canal itself. And this is the railway bridge. And this is, I'm so indebted to Ken Larkin and the wonderful Heritage Group out in Ballyfermot for their photographic collection, and to Ken for allowing us to use some of the images today. This is the perfect image to show you how rural the landscape was in Ballyfermot at the time. Just the railway line working its way through the fields, and you can see the way the embankments were built up on either side. They're the remains of them literally digging out the railway line in the 1800s, in the middle 1800s, and they just piled the earth on either side. So these embankments become part of our story also. And again, as I mentioned, there was a canal bridge further up. So just so we don't get our bridges mixed up, and we're not talking about a canal incident, we're actually talking about a railway incident today, but linked to the bridge over the railway, the road continued, and it gives us the bridge over the canal. And why this was important was it was leading to a place employment in the area, the mills at Killeen, the mills in Bluebell, the mills at the Cammock Mills located all in the general area. So people made their way around this area by bicycle, by horse and cart, on foot. It was you wandered around a country area in order to get to your place of employment at the time 100 years ago. It's a very rural landscape. And when we examined it and we looked at it in more details, particularly using the 1911 census, it became very obvious that it was a mixture of large farms and small cottage clusters. So the cottage clusters would be the labourers that were working in the farms in the area. And then we dug in the sense that we certainly found quite a lot of farmers, labourers, a lot listed themselves as dairymen. We have our mill workers, they're important. The other thing that the canal gave us was a group of people who worked in the waterworks connected with Dublin City at the time. And of course, that key employer, that key area that most people made their way to work in at the time, the railway works in Inchicore. Behind all of this community, there's a huge association in the area with the 4th Battalion of the IRA. This is 4th Battalion area. It stretches right out from the inner city, but it also covers the Ballyfermot area at the time. Just going back a little bit more than 100 years ago, and to kind of give us a little build-up to the events out in Ballyfermot on that July day. It goes back to the 21st of January in 1919, and this, of course, is the first Dáil being held in the Mansion House. A couple of key people that were involved there were Joe Mcgray and Countess Markievicz, who are both marked as being Feiglosa Galuf, or imprisoned by the foreigners, yet they are in attendance at the Dáil. They're on the Dáil listing, having been elected. Just that on a point there, Countess Markievicz, for example, was elected in the St. Patrick's Division. We'd know that as the Liberties of Dublin today. Joe McGrath is elected in the East Division. Again, this whole area would be South Central Dublin if we were looking at the area today. Coincidentally, the same day that we have the first Dáil, we have the Solohead Beg ambush in County Tipperary, where 2 RIC constables are killed, and that is generally acknowledged to be the start of the War of Independence. And this is where we're leading up. I'm giving you a little pocket history on it just to get us to our event. In the preceding years, where as in 1916, more or less all happened in 1 week, the War of Independence goes out over a number of years, and the events slowly build up from small skirmishes, small ambushes, small incidents that are, made small headlines in the newspaper, to events like this one in Crumlin Village at the RIC barracks on the 8th of October 1920, 100 years ago, last October. And you can see from this, things are really escalating at this stage. These would have been talking points in our rural area of Ballyfermot. It had been ordered that the Crumlin RIC barracks was to be destroyed, and it was going to be mined, completely mined with explosives, also to be saturated with petrol. And when they ignited the mine fuse on this occasion, and the front hall of the building, have an image of it there on my screen, started to burn. The volunteers outside hear shouting, and they realised that a member of their own engineering party was actually trapped inside. He is rescued, but his hands and face are badly burnt in the incident, and he's brought to Miss Flood's house on the Nace Road, where a doctor attended to him. If you want a general idea of where Flood's farm was, think no further than McDonald's on the Kylemore Road. That's roughly where Flood's farm was, and that's where the casualty, the engineering casualty from the burning of the barracks in Crumlin Village, that's where he was brought. So you can see it's all rural County Dublin, all interlinked, and the Floods were considered a safe house. It was a place where people were brought if they needed attention after an incident like this one. Talking about the Inchicore Railway Works is also interesting. It was being raided quite regularly. In fact, about once a fortnight, the British authorities would turn up and they would raid the works as the daily work was taking place. They never actually found anything, but they suspected something was going on. So much so that they eventually put a military post installed in the Inchicore Works, and there's about 6 or 8 men in there at any one time. Again, they never actually found anything. In the foundry department of the works, they were actually turning out anything from 36 to about 50 finished grenades a day. This is all part of the backroom support that the 4th Battalion had in this part of Dublin. Eventually they were producing anything between 40 to 50 grenades a week. And this is taken from Joe Kinsella's witness statement, again, from somebody who was working in the Inchicore Works at the time. The other things that would have been spoken about at the time were recent War of Independence incidents. Imagine rural County Dublin. You're hearing of events in town. Some of them are very close to home. This particular one, the events of Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November 1920, again, we just passed the centenary of this, concerned one lad who would have been very well known in the general Ballyfermot, Bluebell, Crumlin area. And this is Joe Traynor from Ballymount. He lived in Ballymount Cottages. His funeral, he's killed at the incident in Croke Park as he tries to make his escape over the wall. And he's actually cared for by the Ring family, who eventually get him to hospital. But sadly, Joe dies in hospital later that day, one of the casualties of Bloody Sunday at Croke Park. Joe Traynor would have been a talking point in the general Ballyfermot area because he's buried in the cemetery in Bluebell. And you can see on my screen there Joe Traynor's grave in Bluebell Cemetery, tended by his family. In fact, those wreaths were placed there in November last year to commemorate the centenary of his death. But this would have had a huge effect on the local area. A local boy, imagine Ballymount cottages would have had connections with Ballyfermot, all the cottages in and around Ballyfermot. Families were interconnected, interlinked. You had relations nearby. This would have been a huge talking point. The events of Bloody Sunday in Croke Park would have been very close to home in Ballyfermot with the loss of Joe Traynor, who was involved in the local football team, the Robert Emmets of the Emmets Football Club, up on the Nace Road itself. So again, very, very local incidents and connected to the area itself. There were a lot of transport raids taking place. I have one incident here where 2 further lorries are destroyed. They had been loaded up with material, bricks and mortar at the brickworks in Dolphins Barn. At this time, Baldonnel is being constructed. So they're taking all the building materials from the city. They're also taking the workers from the city. In this particular case, the drivers were ordered to drive to the quarry in Kinnage, and the lorries were dumped into the quarry there. Today we know that as Sundrive Park. The British military returned the next day. They succeeded in retrieving 1 lorry. Someday the archaeological dig that takes place in Sundrive Park will reveal another military lorry somewhere down deep in the mud for another day. But here's another incident that happened up in Bluebell, where 2 British dispatch motorcycle riders were held up and their bicycles and dispatches were confiscated. The dispatches are sent to the IRA headquarters. The bicycles are handed over to the volunteer unit in South County Dublin. They would have been taken up into the Dublin Mountains and handed over, probably in somewhere like Glencree or somewhere close to it. That was a general handing over spot for different things like that. They used the rural area to their advantage. And these were all a number of incidents, all connected with transport taking place in County Dublin through the War of Independence. This is another interesting one, and this actually gets confused with the incident that we're going to that Liz is going to go into in more detail in a few minutes. And again, it is an incident on the railway bridge in Ballyfermot, and it involves the attack on RIC in that general area. Sergeant Hallisey and the head constable Mulrooney and another chap called Constable Neal. Now this is the newspaper account. The killed and wounded men were members of a small cycling patrol and were proceeding from Dublin to Lucan. So imagine County Dublin in its rural sense. You're moving from one part of the county to another. And they reckon that in the newspaper account here tells us that the shooting occurred about 2 miles west of the city. Every incident like this then had consequences for the local community. Most of the houses in Clondalkin on this occasion are raided by Crown forces, and many of the houses in the Inchicore district were also raided because, here it's noted, the people who were involved were employees of the Inchicore Railway Works. A lot of people who were working there were questioned and searched following this incident on the bridge. They say Dublin Castle report of the incident advises us that the cycle patrol of RIC, consisting of the head constable and 3 other police, and we know there's 2 other involved, were ambushed at Ballyfermot. Sergeant Hallisey was killed and Mulrooney and Neal were seriously wounded. If we look at the witness statement for that, this gives us a little bit more information on it, and we see here that it was actually a little bit more than just a passing patrol. The volunteers were out actively seizing British military transports wherever they could get their hands on them. And then they would destroy them by fire and put them out of action by smashing them up. And one day, this particular lorry was taken down to the Bluebell lane in the vicinity of the nugget factory at Bluebell and destroyed by burning. The RIC go down to examine the truck. Then they realised that the volunteers are in the area, and when they took up the position near the railway bridge at Ballyfermot, as the RIC were going back to Lucan, that's when they were ambushed. So there was a bit of a build-up to the incident that you wouldn't get from just the actual newspaper cutting. Just a little aside, you see there the vicinity of the nugget factory. Well, I had a little look around the city archive, and lo and behold, didn't I find a great photograph of the nugget factory. The nugget factory, of course, is the nugget boot polish factory, the former Cammack mills in Bluebell, and of course we have the nugget cottages in and around Bluebell too. This is all part of the landscape of the wider Ballyfermot area. You can see that these incidents had been taking place. Very indebted actually to the City Archive for this wonderful photograph. No denying where the building is. It's painted so clearly on the roof of the premises. You won't get that image today. And of course, then going again through the newspapers, we actually find here is the funeral of Head Constable Mulrooney, and this took place in the north of Ireland, and what a huge turnout that was. So incidents in Ballyfermot had a national effect and had an effect in other parts of our country as well. So train ambushes then are the natural progression from this type of patrol ambush that was going on in the general area. So a new tactic from just post Bloody Sunday was attacking or ambushing trains. This would disrupt the whole military structure within Ireland. You could no longer move troops, equipment, horses safely from one part of the country to the other if the trains are coming under attack. So from late 1920 onwards, we get a sequence of incidents involving trains, and this is part of this new IRA tactic. We have one taking place, for example, in Mill Street in County Cork. There's others then noted at places like Durrow Station and Ballylynch Level Crossing in Waterford. The Headford Junction in Killarney, that becomes a key area, and it is noted on a number of occasions there were various incidents in and around that part of the country. Then they start to really build up into a number of incidents. We get ones mentioned at Upton, there's another in Limerick, Armagh, Ennis. It just keeps going on. And then closer to home in Dublin, we find then we have the Drumcondra train ambush. There's another one in Killester. And then we have the one in Ballyfermot. I'm going to let Liz take up the story from here. Thank you all very much.
Thanks a million, Cathy. So now I have to follow on from that. So I'm just going to share my screen and just again, bear with me for 1 second. And Cathy has really set the scene there and the build up to it. So I hope I don't disappoint. So everyone, I would just like to say a huge thank you again to Anne-Marie and Gillian for hosting today's event and for all of you for tuning in to us to hear this story. So I'm going to pick up where Cathy left off. So Cathy has fantastically set the scene here. But so what actually happened on that day? So the ambush and who was involved. So Cathy has mentioned already that it was the area, this whole area was the area of the 4th Battalion of Dublin Brigade of the IRA. It was a massive area that they controlled. But who was actually involved in this operation were the ordinary members of the 4th Battalion, but also the active service unit. But what was the active service unit? Now, this was a unit that had been set up at the end of 1920. They were set up after Bloody Sunday. Bloody Sunday is a massive turning point. Up to this point, what we have to remember about the IRA, the volunteers, is that it was a volunteer army. you have thousands of members across the country, but it was a part-time army. So you have a core unit of men in the various counties that would be full-time operational, the flying columns and so on, but you didn't really have that in Dublin, with the exception of Michael Collins' squad. But because of Bloody Sunday, the arrests that follow, because you have mass arrests that follow after Bloody Sunday, it was decided that the IRA in Dublin should set up a dedicated full-time unit of volunteers, and they would be paid, because the volunteers weren't paid. That's why a lot of the ambushes happen, you know, in the middle of the day or in the evening, because it would be at lunchtime and work when volunteers could go and take part in an ambush, or in the evening after their work had been finished. So set up in December 1920, whole-time service, and they were to bring the fight to the enemy. This is their whole aim. They are to just harass and attack the Crown forces, the DMP, who were pretty neutral at that stage. And anyway, but and the RIC in Dublin, you see an opportunity, you just seize it. But they were under direct control of the IRA GHQ in Dublin. So this would be Collins, Richard Mulcahy, and so on. Now, it was made up of 4 sections, and that mirrored the 4 battalions of the Dublin City Brigade of the IRA. So there was number 1 and number 2 sections, and they operated on the north side of the city. So these lads are in their area, and then the 3rd and 4th operated on the south side, which again, it's their battalion areas. They know the streets, they know their areas. The thing is that the IRA GHQ tried to sort of control the active service unit, as in telling them where to actually go and attack, you know, trying to direct their operations. And this really early on proved that it wasn't going to work, because in one instance, I think it was number 1 section, were nearly completely arrested because they'd been hanging around. IRA GHQ wanted reports. Once this incident happened, where that section was, the whole section was nearly arrested, the active service unit went, nah, ain't going to happen. We will seize the opportunity. We will basically send in reports after the event, but you're not getting the reports beforehand. We don't need your permission. You've set us up. We'll take the fight to the enemy. So who was involved, or who are members of the number 4 section of the active service unit? Well, this man, Pádraig O'Connor, is a key member, and have to say a huge thank you to Diarmuid O'Connor for the image here. But Pádraig had been involved in the Irish Volunteers in 1916. His whole family were involved, including his sister. But he begins to really rise up through the ranks after 1916. He was a member of F Company of the 4 battalions. They were operating around the Inchicore area. He himself is from Inchicore, but then their field of operation would include Ballyfermot. And he was became a member of the number 4 section of the active service unit when it was set up. But again, he continues to rise in the ranks. He later became the 2nd lieutenant of the active service unit. And then at this point, when the ambush actually takes place, the active service unit had been reorganised, because you had the event on the 25th of May, which was the burning of the Custom House. Members of the active service unit were involved. You have the arrests that take place. So a lot of number 1 and 2 section active service unit had been arrested that day with members of the squad. So the active service unit amalgamated. There were only 2 sections operating in Dublin at the time of the Ballyfermot ambush, number 1 and number 2. Number 1 was on the north side, and then you have number 2, which is on the south side. And Pádraig O'Connor, at the time of the ambush, was the OC of the south side section. So you can see they're a very important person, and I would highly recommend reading Pádraig's witness statement. And if you can't get your hands on the book, Sleep Soldier Sleep, it's like it's gold dust. But that was his book. It was written by his nephew Diarmuid, an amazing account. So we know that Pádraig is involved, but who else was involved in the operation that day? So just a few, because as we're finding out, there's more and more men coming out that were involved, or revealing themselves that were involved in this event. But Joe Mcguinness, he was again F Company 4th Battalion, and again a member of number 4 section of the active service unit. He and Paddy O'Connor very, very close, and where you find one, you find the other pretty much. Pat Mccray is a bit different, because he was a member of B Company 2nd Battalion. And he was also a member of the squad. So actually, this isn't his area, but there is a reason why Pat Mccray is there on that day. We also have George Nolan, and he was a member of the of A Company, 4th Battalion, and again, number 4 section of the Active Service Unit. And we have Lawrence Morta, again, F Company. So you can start to see F Company is the dominant company in this attack. Again, number 4 section of the Active Service Unit, and again, a great, fantastic image there, courtesy of Kathleen Morta of Lawrence. But then we have others who weren't necessarily members of the Active Service Unit. We have Jimmy Mcguinness, and again, number 4 section, Thompson gun. You can see that beside him, and this is a critical sort of weapon at this time, because the IRA had actually imported a small amount of Thompson submachine guns into Ireland. Now, if they had ordered 500, but they were actually impounded in Hoboken. So at this time, they were just waiting on the docks. They weren't coming to Ireland. They did eventually make their way over to Ireland, but they had smuggled in a few, and they had been used in one of the previous train ambushes that Cathy mentioned. But at the Ballyfermot troop train ambush, it's the first time the Thompson gun is used successfully. Edward Bourne, F Company, 4th Battalion, another F Company man, Patrick Lanigan, Liam Kane, F Company, Daniel Jevons, Active Service Unit, Michael Carroll, F Company, and then Michael J. Stack was a member of number 4 section. So we can see there, this is a really, it pretty much is an F Company job, but all of these men would have been very, very close. They would have been neighbours. They would have worked together. It's a really close, tight unit, and that's what you find with the companies. It is made up of neighbours and friends and so on. But why did this ambush happen? And so according to George Nolan, he said the orders were sent to the section commander, Pádraig O'Connor, that a troop train would be proceeding from Dublin to the Curragh on a certain morning, and that was to be attacked at Ballyfermot. See, the thing was, with the arrests after Bloody Sunday, it looked to the British that the Dublin Brigade of the IRA were wiped out. 100 men pretty much had been arrested on that day. The thing is, with the War of Independence, it goes in waves. So the IRA have successes, but then the British come back and they hit back hard, and you have arrests, you have, you know, IRA men being killed, and it looks like the IRA is on its knees. And that was the case in November 1920, and the IRA hit back with the events on Bloody Sunday. The British hit back with the mass arrests and so on. And in the early parts of 1921, again, it looked like that was the same situation. The IRA hit back with more ambush, and then we have the Custom House in May. So looking from the British perspective, they have them on their knees. But the IRA were told, regroup, get out, harass at every opportunity, and the IRA changed their tactics. So whereas you don't have a lot of major engagements, as in 40, 50, 60 men involved, you can have 2 or 3 men involved in an action, in an attack. And they started to focus their attention on the transport, on the supplies, as well as attacking the Crown forces, because the IRA also realised that if you take out a lorry, if you take out an armoured car, that means that troops cannot get from A to B. Also, money comes into it. The IRA realised that if you killed a horse, it was actually worth more than a soldier. So you see them changing their MO. But of course, the troops are being transported from point A to point B, and troop trains become the focus of attack. But also in this particular case, you have a number of horses as well. So there's a number of reasons why it is being, or they were told to attack it. And who their targets were the Gordon Highlanders. Now, what we tend to think of with the War of Independence, the main targets initially were the RIC, were G Division, the political branch of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, but the auxiliaries and Black and Tans when they arrived, but there were huge amounts of British regiments in Ireland at the time. We've got the Essex down in Cork, there's a Stout Staffs as well, but in this particular case it was the Gordon Highlanders that were the targets of this the IRA in this particular instance. So what was the plan of the ambush? Well, again, George Nolan, the witness statements and the pension files are just an amazing resource. If you haven't looked at them, please do. They're absolutely fantastic. But according to George Nolan in his witness statement, he said the plan was a very simple one. 3 members to take tins of petrol from a pony and car and bring them along with pieces of sacking. The sacks are to be saturated with the petrol and thrown on top of the carriages as the train passed under the bridge. One man of our party, armed for the first time with a Thompson submachine gun, was to spray the top of the carriages with fire and light the saturated petrol stacks. We took up positions as ordered. 4 of us were on the bridge, and Jimmy Mcguinness with the Thompson machine gun. The remainder of the section were at both sides of the railway behind the embankment. So that photograph that Cathy showed you earlier, you can see, you can actually picture where the men were. By reading this statement, you can see exactly where the men were positioned. And here we have a close-up of it there. So we have 5 men on the bridge, and who they were Pádraig O'Connor, Michael J. Stack, Joseph Mcguinness, George Nolan, and Jimmy Mcguinness, again armed with the Thompson submachine gun. Now, the embankment, so this is where the other volunteers would have been spread out all along. So when the train is attacked, you have obviously the main focus is coming from over the bridge, but then once the attack begins, the fire will come from both sides. So basically, the train is under attack from all angles. So what happened? So according to Pádraig O'Connor and his witness statement, he basically explains it here. So information was received that a party of troops with stores would be travelling on the 1 o'clock passenger train from Kingsbridge on Friday, the 8th July 1921. And where the information was coming from was people working in the train stations. Like the information that was coming into the IRA, the intelligence information that was coming in, it was coming in from everywhere. Inchicore railway work, Cathy mentioned it as in how it was so important for the grenade factory and so on. But men who were working there would also be watching what was going on, passing on information, and that information was then fed back to the local units. Plans were made to attack the train at the railway bridge at Ballyfermot. My half company assembled at the Tenters Fields in Cork Street and cycled to Ballyfermot. So they're all the way in the middle of the Liberty, so at the Tenters, and they cycle out to Ballyfermot. They lined the embankment on the left-hand side of the bridge, and there was a scout put on the timber bridge, the pass bridge, to signal what portion of the train the military occupied. So again, you've got these eyes watching everything, and the signals would be coming through to the main attacking party. Arrangements were also made to get this information at Kingsbridge and bring it up by motorcycle. Arrangements were made to fire on the bridge with his Thompson gun. So he's talking, or this is Michael J. Stack, sorry, talking about, again, what happened. So he's talking about Jim Mcguinness. The remainder of the section took up positions on the bank of the railway line. So again, reinforcing what Pádraig O'Connor had said. When the train, which we're expecting, passed Inchicore, a signal was given, and when the train entered the tunnel at Ballyfermot, I poured the petrol on the roof of the train. So we know that's Michael Stack, that is the one that was actually pouring the petrol on top of the train. O'Connor then threw the lighted sacks onto the petrol-soaked roofs, and Mcguinness opened fire with the Thompson gun as the train emerged from the tunnel. The section of the bank opened fire with the revolvers. By this time, the train was well ablaze. The grenade men then came into action. So you have, if you can imagine, you have the gunfire coming from the Thompson, then you've got grenade explosions, there's fire raining down on this train. The casualties are heavy on the British that day. Now, what did the newspaper reports, and Cathy alludes to this earlier on, the newspapers are fantastic, again, for giving the accounts from different perspectives. And here's where we get the human side of the story as well, but also what was like to be on the train that day. So here we have it. Very graphic accounts. Train bombed, groom's leg blown off, several passengers injured. So just to read it out to you here, what the official report stated: General Military Headquarters Dublin, in an official report states that at 1:30 o'clock on Friday the 8th, a passenger train which contained a party of the Gordon Highlanders was bombed and fired at between Clondalkin and Inchicore, County Dublin, and several civilian passengers were wounded, one of them very seriously. The explosions of the bombs and the sharp rattle of the machine gun and rifle fire were heard distinctly over a wide area. The bullets of the attacking party rattled against the train and smashed the windows. None of the soldiers that were struck, but at least four civilian passengers were injured by bullets or fragments of bombs and glass. The injuries of 3 were not very serious, but the 4th, Mr. John Rossiter, was badly wounded and he subsequently died. One leg was severed and the other was injured in several places. What is great about the newspapers is that it does give you that personal information. And we know that Mr. Rossiter, he was an employee of Mr. J.J. Parkinson, the well-known Curragh trainer, and was taking the horses back from the races to the training establishment. So the casualty that day, it was a civilian, sadly, that died that day, and his name was John Rossiter. Now, what we have here again, another report from the newspapers. And what we have, I'm just going to read it out for you here. The scene of the ambush was Ballyfermot Bridge. Here, a party of rebels had made their preparations, and when the train appeared, some posted on the bridge, while others had taken up positions on the embankment on either side of the permanent way. When the train reached the bridge, the signal for the attack was given, and a heavy fire was opened from both sides at the soldiers sitting in the carriages. The attackers had placed a machine gun in position, and drums of ammunition were emptied at the train. While some of them used revolvers and automatic pistols, others fired bombs. At the same time, those who were stationed on the bridge poured petrol on the wagons and threw down burning rags in an attempt to destroy the military equipment. The soldiers returned fire, leaning out the windows. A wild panic took place among civilians and among civilian passengers, and there was a hurried scramble for safety on the floor, and in some compartments as many as 2 or 3 people were lying on top of one another. And what we're getting there is the real sense of what it was like to be a civilian in a situation like this. But what is important here as well about the newspaper report is that it does, or the witness statements mirror what was actually recounted very close to the events, literally on that day. The witness statements are made 20, 30 years after the event. Now, when you look at the men who took part in it, and what they recall about the event was that this is the 8th of July. Now, there were peace talks going on, but they talk about waiting to see what the newspaper headlines would be. They were expecting newspapers to just be dominated by this attack on the troop train. But you can see from this newspaper headline, it's a dual headline, because what you have here is peace conference resumed. So there's peace talks that are taking place in the Mansion House at that time. And then you have the report of the troop train attack. And I suppose what is really symbolic about this headline here, this front page of the Evening Herald, is that it is shown the end of one thing and, you know, the beginning of something else. So the War of Independence is coming to an end. This is the last major event in Dublin of the War of Independence. The peace conference is resumed. And then, of course, the next day, it is finally announced that a truce will come into effect. The War of Independence will finally end. And it proves that the Ballyfermot train ambush is the last major event of this conflict in Dublin, carried out by members of F Company 4th Battalion and the Active Service Unit. Now, when the truce will come into effect, it was on the 11th of July, 1921 at noon. Now, there were orders given to units around the country that they could, if they wanted to, you know, free for all, go and attack. A lot of units didn't take place or take part in any actions. Some did. In Dublin, there was another major event planned. It was the shooting up that was going to happen in O'Connell Street, where at curfew, basically all units of Dublin Brigade of the IRA were going to shoot any auxiliaries, British soldier, policeman, and anyone who was with them in O'Connell Street. But it was called off because the truce was going to be coming in the next day. So, as I said, what we have here, the Ballyfermot troop train ambush, is the last major event of the War of Independence. And this is, again, the headlines. The newspapers are full of these headlines. Irish hostilities to cease today. The War of Independence was over. And I suppose to end it, it's best left up to one of the people that was there on what they felt about the truce, what they felt about being involved in that operation, which was reported. When the newspapers reported it, they didn't report accurately, really, the aftermath of this ambush, because Pádraig O'Connor and a few others went to actually see the damage that was done. And he believes that from what he saw, that it wasn't just 4 civilians that were wounded and 1 civilian killed. The damage done to the train, a lot more people had to have been wounded in this attack, including soldiers. It was primarily soldiers, but because the peace talks were going on, it seems that the newspapers didn't want to report that any military were involved. But from Pádraig O'Connor's account, no one, you know, really, 4 people to be only wounded, it was unbelievable. But Michael J. Stack, we'll leave the end word to him. his reflections on the Ballyfermot train ambush. This is a glorious send-off for the ASU after a hard struggle against the enemy that was superior in strength and arms, but not in courage. The truce was declared the following Monday. And I would just like to say a huge thank you to all of you for tuning in. We could talk about this troop train ambush for 3-4 hours, but we're very limited with time. But I hope that what Cathy and myself have shown you is that how a community was involved in major events in the War of Independence, in the revolutionary era, and it just shows that all of our communities have a story to tell, and people who went before us were involved in these hugely important events, and we are very, very lucky to now have the opportunity with the source that are available to tell these stories. So I would just like to end on that and say thanks a million for listening and tuning in to us today. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz. That was absolutely fantastic. And thanks very much, Cathy, for your presentation as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed both of those now. It's very engaging. I am just wondering, I don't see many questions coming in yet. So I just say to everybody who's tuned in to say you can pop if you have any questions for Cathy and Liz, you can pop them in the chat box now. What we are getting at the moment, though, is congratulations on the talk. And people are saying it's wonderful. So they're both... yeah, so actually we have Niall Ring here. 1 second. How did the ASU and the squad get on? That's from Niall Ring. We have one question there now. So
trying to attempt there, Neil. Hey Neil, thanks for tuning in. There were a few it wasn't all sort of easy plain sailing after they were amalgamated, and this goes to the loyalties of the previous leader of the Active Service Unit, Paddy Flanagan. So what happened after the arrests at the Custom House, the squad and the Active Service Unit were depleted, but it's it's really number 2 section of the Active Service Unit that is depleted. None of the Active Service Unit, as in number 4 section, were arrested. Number 3, as far as I know, number 1, not many, if any. But then with that amalgamation, Paddy Daly, who had been one of the OCs of the squad, he's then appointed overall commander of what becomes the Dublin Guard. So when they amalgamate, they become known as the Dublin Guard. And a lot of guys actually left because Paddy O'Flanagan had not been given the position of being OC, and there was a lot of loyalty to him, so a number of them do leave. But now Pádraig O'Connor, you know, he's stayed within that unit, and what you find then is that core unit then become the 4 soldiers of the new National Army when it is established in January 1922. So a few teething problems to begin with. And those who who are so loyal to Paddy Flanagan, leave, and then you have Paddy Daly being in charge, if that answers the question.
That's fabulous. Thanks very much. That's great. We have another question, actually, just that might tie in with what you were saying there a moment ago, from Alison Bowen. It's was Paddy Daly the person involved with the Ballyfermot massacre? I think yeah,
that's him. The butcher Daly. You don't get him like that for being a nice person. The thing is that when you're looking, and look, we can't justify anything what happened in the Civil War, and this is the big thing that's coming down the line, the big difficulty that we're going to have. Unfortunately, the Dublin Guard are sent down to Kerry at that period, and amongst that group are Paddy Daly, Dave Nelligan, the Hammers Nelligan again. You know, you give them these nicknames and you can only imagine why. But there were a number of Kerry men also that were members of the Dublin Guard. But things like Ballyseedy don't just happen out of the blue. There is a reason for Ballyseedy, and it's key to the Dublin Guard being down there. But if I can just briefly really explain it, and again, it's not to justify it, but just to understand how something like that can happen. So you have the ambush and Knocknagoshel, trap mine that is set by the Anti-Treaty IRA for Paddy Pats O'Connor, who was Free State Kerry. He was really a thorn in the side of the Anti-Treaty IRA, so they wanted to get him. he's told this arms cache is in Knocknagoshel. He goes with a patrol, including a number of Dublin Guards. Stapleton is one of them. When they go, they look and the mine goes off. Paddy Potts O'Connor is killed, and 2 of the Dublin Guards, who had been friends with Paddy O'Daly and so on since the War of Independence. Like, things these guys did together, like they're closer than brothers. They went ballistic. And what comes out of Knocknagoshel is that the whole of the Kerry Brigade anti-treaty was going to pay for Knocknagoshel. So number 1, 2 and 3 brigades of the Kerry IRA were hit. So you've got Ballyfermot and Countess Bridge on the 6th of March, where they take the fellas out. You've got them tied around the landmines. They're blown up. You've got Stephen Fuller surviving at Ballyfermot. There's another survivor at Countess Bridge. The Free State troops think everyone is gone, then they realise they're survivors, but they hadn't got the last brigade. So you have then at Carsivane, you have the last group where, to ensure there was no survivors, that they shot them in the legs and placed them on the mine and then killed them. And then there's the Clashmelkin Caves and so on. There's the guy that shot after Truce, and that all goes back to Knocknagoshel. And Paddy Daly is there, and a number of Dublin Guards, but also there were Kerry men that were members of the Dublin Guards as well. So this is the stuff we're going to have to look at and address, and it's going to be so painful. But when you see through the research and the accounts, it's like something just doesn't happen out of the blue. There's always a trigger, and it's just to try to understand how something so barbaric could happen. And it's awful, and it's going to be pretty difficult to look at this, but we have to, you know.
Okay, that's fantastic, Liz. Thanks very much. I have 2 more questions here, so one of you girls can answer if you can. So one is from Adrian Donnelly, saying, are accurate records of British casualties available to researchers? So I'm not sure who will answer what.
Cathy, you're on mute, Cathy.
I was just making sure the cat didn't interrupt me again. Sorry for that. This is a bit of a challenge. In fairness to the Irish records, and in fairness to the way the National Archives, the National Library and the City Archive have managed to put stuff together, I suppose we're filling a gap because so much was lost in Irish history. We have let out an awful lot of stuff, and it's from that Liz and I have been really doing a lot of work, piecing together things from witness statements, using the newspapers, looking at the pension files, trying to find the common ground. So when you find the common ground with that level of primary sources, you're pretty much on track to the truth. I mean, I think that would be fair enough if you can balance one out with the other. The British records are not that freely available. A lot of them are behind paywalls, and a lot of them do not seem to be made available. I don't know whether there's politics in that. I suspect there still is, because remember, we still have 6 counties of our country that are unresolved, and there are sensitivities around a lot of things. I found it quite difficult to get to British records. I could find some, a lot of it done by Irish researchers who had gone abroad, but certainly not as freely available as we could find the ones that we've been using extensively for talks like this. It's a challenge. You do find nuggets sometimes. Sometimes you find nice little gems. I actually found the raid on my own family home, and I found the British records for that one, which was, quite revealing and told a different story to what was in newspaper accounts and what was in the Sinn Féin journals and things like that. But it's still a work in progress, and we are completely open to reviewing everything that we're doing. If we find more information, we constantly do that. And Liz and I have collaborated on quite a number of little projects now. What we do try to do is find the local story that will tell or inform the national one. And this is why the Ballyfermot incident is so useful for actually looking at an event that took place in Ballyfermot with all those other connections to Inchicore and Bluebell and the Tenterfields and the Liberties and whatever else it might be. They tell us part of the national story. This is literally days before the truce is called. So this is the level of engagement and incident that was taking place at a small rural railway bridge in Ballyfermot. And yet it's part of that bigger national story, which is going to be explored through the talks that the Library and Archive are organising, all about the truce itself. So if you know what I mean, that's what we try to do, make it so local and so real. That bridge is still there. It's still part, it's travelled over by hundreds of people every day. And yet that's a key part of the whole national story, which has created the country we live in today. So I've half answered the question, but it is a challenge about the British records. They're not as freely available as our own ones are.
And just to come in on that, Cathy, as well, and Cathy alludes to this when we're doing the research for this, at this time when you've got the truce talks, like, you know, peace talks they're in the middle of it. Public opinion back in England was waning for support. And it's like, if you reveal, you know, how many soldiers are killed or wounded, how will that reflect back home? The British are always thinking, you know, propaganda is such an important weapon in this war as well. But you do find that it is more difficult to get British casualty lists, what the British will report. Now you will maybe find them later on if there's compensation claims for, you know, a soldier or something like that, but they're not as freely available in terms of, say, the volunteers given that information, as in a volunteer died or so on. It's not as forthcoming from the British point of view. That's what I found in any way. And Pádraig O'Connor, like, he literally went down and saw the troop train, and he couldn't believe that, you know, from the reports, that no soldiers were wounded, and looking at the devastation that was caused in that particular section of the train, he couldn't believe that troops weren't actually injured in that. But according to the newspapers on the official report, no troops were wounded. It's hard to believe.
Thanks very much, both Cathy and Liz. That's fantastic. I think I have two more questions here, and one I think you might have already answered just in the course of the last query. So it's from Paul Newton, and he says, do we know what official British records say of the event? And he says then one assumes that whatever was admitted at the time, an official record must exist. And he also said, when you mentioned Paddy Flanagan, he knows a member of the family and what happened to him. So I'm not sure if you can help with that one.
Do you want to answer the first part, Cathy? I'll answer the second one.
Yeah, we have kind of mentioned about the British records, so I suppose it's slight little overlap. Yeah, I mean, you've got to imagine the time, and Liz really nailed it quite well there. Think of the times we're in. We're just on the cusp of the truce being called. We're on the cusp of peace talks. An awful lot of things just seem to drop out of the news. Incidents that would have been splattered all over headlines in normal times. I'm using that in inverted commas, if you know what I mean. In the normal run of the War of Independence, these would have been hugely reported on. They're completely superseded by the truce. Completely, peace is arriving. Everything's called, a halt is being called, and it's almost like all of those incidents just drop out of the news. So this is the challenge we have, because we're left then with witness statements written maybe 20, 30, 40 years after the event. You're left with pension files, which have only recently, you know, as in the last few years, been revealed. You know, and an incident even like the Ballyfermot train ambush, I was very surprised at the lack of local knowledge of that particular incident. So that'll just give you an idea of how that had even fallen out of local stories, local folklore. I actually was quite amazed that so many people in Ballyfermot had never even heard of it. And didn't get the relevance of it in relation to that national story. So it's, you know, that's a really good example of something. It's the very, very last incident, more or less, that we have in Dublin, a key incident, a major attack on some of infrastructure, and it's not even in local folklore in the same way as, say, the GPO is in the 1916 story, you know. So they're the things that It just shows you that the actual timing of it at the very, very end, just on the cusp of truce. Liz's headline of the Herald is amazing. They're balanced. The peace talks resume. Train attacked in County Dublin. They're balanced headlines. So the train attacked in Ballyfermot is of less information, of less importance to the fact that peace is arriving. So that's where it falls down.
Lovely.
And Flanagan,
Flanagan, yes.
Flanagan, yeah.
What happens in Paddy Flanagan is just, you know, is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the aftermath of this. The pension files, again, if anyone hasn't looked, I would recommend go on to the pension files, because what you're seeing there is the impact of the conflict on people later on. And Paddy Flanagan is one of them, that what he did, what he saw, what he witnessed had a huge effect on his mental health. And the amount, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, quite a number of men and women who were involved suffered from this, and Paddy Flanagan is one of them. It's heartbreaking when you read the pension files, because you see they give the addresses of the different times that they claimed, like, you know, or putting in the applications, and the amount of addresses that, you know, it's Grangegorman. The amount of veterans that are in Grangegorman are some asylum. And, you know, like we're struggling with mental health today. Like, imagine, like, back in the 50s, the 40s, when they're living through this, like it must have been hugely traumatic, and for their families. And you have letters being written on behalf of them from their comrades, and they're just heartbreaking. But what those letters show is the huge personal cost and the mental toll, because the majority of these men and women were not trained soldiers. They were volunteers. They were men and women going about their ordinary business that took part in this major event. And there's a quote that I'll use from a guy who was an instructor, a military trainer for when the American Army, when they were in Vietnam. And he basically said, you know, we programmed these guys to kill, but nobody unprogrammed them. And that's what you were dealing with. That's what these people were dealing with. They couldn't, a lot of them unfortunately couldn't handle what they had been exposed to. And then and they're the participants. You then have the people who weren't the participants and what they had to deal with. So that's an area that now is being looked at. And just very sadly, Paddy O'Flanagan is just one of those victims.
Oh, thanks very much, Liz. That's answered brilliantly. Thank you. And thanks to Cathy as well for answering brilliantly earlier. I think we'll have time maybe for just two last quick questions. I could just get you to, if you can answer them for us. So one is Hugh Wilde. He says, thanks for the wonderful and very informative talk. And he just wanted to know, are there any members of the ASU known to be buried in Bluebell Cemetery?
Okay. If anybody wants to check Bluebell Cemetery records, I'm absolutely delighted to say that we're reverting right back to the Dublin City Library and Archive, because all of the records are online and I had them. Remember, the Bluebell Cemetery would have been relatively new at the time, so it was only there from about 1904. It had been given by the Lord Lansdowne, as in the Lansdowne Valley in Drimnagh. That's a whole other story. So that's why we had people like Joe Traynor buried there. We have Bernard Curtis buried there. That's from the Civil War. So that's where we get Bernard Curtis House in Bluebell. We have John Monks, who was the first casualty of the Civil War, found at the Red Cow. I can see a lot of other talks coming on, Liz. I don't know, I'm not too sure about you. I haven't actually looked at the ASU burials. It's a challenge, and I'm up for it, because those records are online. It has been a lifesaver during the lockdown, having these records online. So if anybody else wants to do a little search, they are freely available through the Dublin City Library and Archive. It's a fascinating little cemetery, well worth going to have a visit to it. Tucked away in behind the industrial estates, not terribly far from the aforementioned McDonald's. So you can always get a bit of lunch if you're in the general area. But it's something that I'd look at. I haven't looked at it yet, but certainly, yeah, that's on the list to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cathy. That's brilliant. And then there's one here, just Raymond McCarthy asked. Now, I'm not sure whether this might be something you can answer or not, but he asks, did the railway operator do a report of the event?
Oh, very good question.
So I'm not sure.
That is a really good question. And again, it's an angle I didn't even think of. So maybe this talk could, it's constantly under review. We put this together in January. We have reviewed it a couple of times even since then. Yeah, certainly we would look at that. They have an anniversary coming up soon as well as, I think, the Inchicore Works. So could be.
Yeah, and they do have a historical society.
Yeah.
So I would, because again, I'd be like Cathy, we just didn't look into that part of it, but it's most likely they would have having to do a report, I imagine.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I would check out the Historical Society in Inchicore Works. They do have a journal. I think they have a website as well, so you'll be able to get in touch with them. But that would be the first place I would check to find out if there was a report made about it.
Lovely, thanks very much. And then just the last question that I have, and then we round it off, it was just a question from Alison asking, weren't there a lot of horses killed, or were there a lot of horses killed on the day?
It was a train full of horses, definitely. Yeah. And they were part of the targets, if you like. I know the Gordon Highlands are part of it as well. It was a train full of horses, and that's borne out by the actual declared civilian casualty who was actually bringing horses back. I think it was from the horse show at the spring show or something like that as well. Again, something, hands up, haven't done a count on the horses. But again, it's something, we could certainly factor in for future and see if we can track that down. Considering the way the story drops out of the news because of the subsequent events, that's where it becomes challenging just to get down to that type of minute detail. But, you know, always, everything that we do, we constantly look at more information as it becomes available, and we're always open to suggestions. We're definitely not precious about these things, and anything that enhances it, adds to it, and heightens local awareness. I think that's really key, because this is part of all of our shared histories. And when we go into incidents like these in such detail and start asking those questions, well, mission accomplished on behalf of Liz and myself. If we've got people thinking at that level of detail, I think we're really getting somewhere where it would have been an incident hardly even spoken about before now.
Brilliant, absolutely. So thanks very much. I think we'll end it there, because I've answered most of the questions that came through. So it remains to be said just to thank Liz and Cathy today for their really engaging talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm originally from Ballyfermot myself, so I found it very interesting to listen to. So I'd also like to thank my co-host Gillian Colton for taking the time out to be here today and help out. So I'd like to thank her for that. And then finally, of course, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for joining in and for sending in your very interesting questions. So I'd like to say thanks very much, and thanks very much, Liz and Cathy. Thank you. We'll end it there. Okay, see you now, everybody. Take care. Bye.
God bless. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.